Welcome back. We want to welcome Dr. Christy Bauman. She is a mother, psychotherapist, teacher, and author, and she's been with us before. Last time she was on, we spent most of our time talking about her most recent book, Theology of the Womb. Today, we want to spend some time reflecting with her on the past year with all of its trauma, and then look forward to 2021 and what we might reasonably expect. Welcome back, Christy.
Thank you for having me, Paul. I'm so excited to be back.
So since we last spoke, you've completed your doctorate at Seattle Pacific University. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. That was a 10-year birthing process that finally finished in June. And actually, I do think the pandemic helped me do that because all of a sudden I couldn't leave and I had a lot of time. Usually at night once my kids were in bed, but I got a lot of time to just push out that research and finish that up. So that was a huge feat for me, and I'm excited about it.
And what were you researching?
Women's well-being. So I was looking at over 10 years of research for what women will say, over 500 women, what they say is the biggest factor indicator that predicts well-being over the lifespan of a woman, particular to their spirituality and their sexuality.
And are you able to share any of those results with us?
Yes. Honestly, if I wanted to just be really quick and not give you the 161 pages of research, I would just say that the number one factor for women in their well-being is their own interpersonal investment in themselves. And so however much self-awareness and self-identity they have contributes to their self-esteem and then therefore their well-being over the lifespan. And the second is community. So because women tend to be relational beings, the wealth of their community and the types of community they have, the more robust portfolio they have of community and input in their life is the other predictor of well-being for them. So that's probably the simplest way to say it. And I'm actually working on a book called Womaneering, coming out in this next year with all of that research of the top 8 things that women do to ensue the best kind of well-being for their life. Yeah.
Well, then we'll look forward to having you back with us to talk about that book.
I can't wait.
So can you paint a picture of what it was like this past year as, you're obviously working on your doctorate, but also someone who counsels others about trauma and abuse in their lives?
Yes. Gratitude and grief is probably the words that I kept finding my clients coming back to. And what was really hard is at the beginning of the pandemic, I went from seeing my clients and then it wasn't safe to continue to see them in person. And so even moving to virtual therapy was a grief. There was something to grieve of not being in each other's presence in a physical way. So I think that was really hard psychologically for a lot of people. And it felt like a psychological trauma. It was like there was a trauma bond. There's this sense when something's happening, we do kind of gather our resources and we get ready, we hunker down for a hard season, for a hurricane, for a snowing in, whatever that might be. But with the pandemic, it felt like we hunkered down as a nation, not knowing when it would end. And we didn't have much time to build supplies. And so a lot of virtual therapy was, how do we build supplies for resilience through something we don't know when it's going to end? And a lot of that was coming into looking where grief was popping up and where gratitude was showing up. I became really sensitive to, what are you grieving today? What are you grateful for today? Because we have to cultivate resilience if we're going to survive.
Agreed. And so what was it like for you as the counselor to do most of your work, using these teletherapy sessions?
Well, part of my magic is being in person, something about, feeling the energy and caring for people. So even though I would actually say there's some privilege to those of us who got to go home and do everything virtually and still have an income and still make money, right? It's those first responders and people who had to be in the hospitals or in the grocery stores working, that they didn't have the luxury that I had. So there was actually, I felt like a kindness and a privilege I had to engage and grapple with of what do I do with my privilege? What do I do that I can make money and still be virtual? And what do I do with this extra time is actually nice, but it's not as beneficial for my clients as being one-on-one with them. So I think that was hard for me. I mean, there was hard to hold, again, my gratitude and then the grief of I can't give the best care that I could give. And this has also been a little bit of a reprieve and a bit of a sabbatical in some ways to just hunker down and hide out.
Mm-hmm. Were you personally touched by any of that trauma in 2020, whether the pandemic or the protests in Seattle or something else?
Yeah. So, I mean, both, sadly, and I'm grateful. When the pandemic first hit, the first time I actually left my house was to go to a protest. And it was interesting what I felt churning in my heart of, this is probably not the safest people gathering. Yes, it's outside. What do? I have my mask. I had gloves on. I mean, I was careful in the physical sense. I actually even told my husband, this is worth me getting childcare because I didn't feel safe enough bringing my children, which growing up in Seattle, that is something we bring our kids to protest or we bring them to different activities. We are those, more liberal hippie people out there. And so there's something beautiful to bring our children to that. And yet it was just not wise. So I was in a protest with my church. My whole church met at a building. We walked down and it was a life-changing experience. I felt so grateful for the gospel, actually, which it just blows my mind. But even when, being here, talking about moments that matter, there was a moment where my pastor's wife and I were going over the bridge and she said, I think I want to go onto the interstate, onto I-5. And I thought, I just don't know. I don't want to take cars on head on. I just don't know. And yet she felt defiant. And I was like, okay, so there was a lot of us. I mean, there were thousands of us really. And so we start going on to I-5 and the cars start to stop. And, I'm having my own mixed feelings about what is happening right now. And at some point we've walked about half a mile and the cars are all stopped and we're walking around cars and we're holding our signs and there is a whole line of police and there are mostly Black individuals where the police are that are being stopped. And so some of Black women turned to our group and they asked us if we would get in between the police officers and us. And that was such a moment where you feel really aware of your mortality and you feel like, okay, I do have privilege as a white human and I don't have that much privilege if you have a gun or something that could harm me or if this goes bad really fast. And I remember standing there looking at that clear shield of that police officer and I knew there were rubber bullets in the guns, but even knowing that, there's something of watching a war movie, watching violence on TV, and then there's another thing standing there knowing my babies are at home and wondering, like, is this worth it? Why am I here? And yet, that woman's face, would you stand in between us? Would you actually see what it's like to walk in my shoes?
Yeah.
For even 5 minutes? Will you see how afraid I live every day? And Paul, I don't know how that moment really changed my life, but something in me turned where it mattered to walk a mile in their shoes or to just experience what it would be like to not have privilege and to not be an authority and to be afraid. So that's how the pandemic started off with us. So it's quite lively. And it was heartbreaking. There was, again, the tsunamis of grief that kept washing over us and our community. And the pressure, like whether it was death or racism or, some sexism, whatever the ism was that was washing over us of oppression, there was something to just let it wash over us and grieve. Mm. And that's how I began my pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talking about that experience reminded me of an experience we had in Ukraine because we were there during the Orange Revolution.
Yes.
And, basically it's like you and 500,000 of your closest friends, they're all protesting the election results. And actually that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Anyway.
Yes.
And so we were warned away, do not go down there, you're a foreigner, and all sorts of things could happen. And then finally it was like, okay, this is way too historic, Mm-hmm. So my wife and I went down there, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. I had never seen people just loving that much and caring for each other that much. And at that moment, then I thought, oh man, it would be so great to have our son along with us, who was a teenager at that point, just as you're talking about, with your children. Right. So I kind of had a little bit of regret. Then afterward, the woman in our office, one of the women, was married to KGB, and nice guy. We knew him, it was great. And he said that there were snipers on the roofs, and they were ready to take people out if things got out of hand. And I was just like, maybe it was okay if, our son was, so, I mean, it's just this mess of, influences and ideas and potentials and, everything else like that. So I get that. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dance of suffering, right? We don't want our children to suffer. And yet what suffering teaches us, if we look biblically, if we look at what we learn, how we stay humble, how we understand resilience, like there's this fine line of, Lord, I want my children to be incredible humans in this world, and I don't want them to die. But, just enough suffering that they can be incredible humans, but not too much. And that dance is always so intriguing. And I think that's what 2020 kind of brought us to is, okay, Lord, suffering, but not too much suffering. Or where is that line of engaging suffering? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and much later, when my son was grown, we had been missionaries together, with him for 5 years in Ukraine. So he was just versed in missionary life and sacrifice, everything else like that. And so he had the opportunity to go on a missions trip to Russia, for 2 weeks. And it's so funny because we were missionaries, and the first thing is is that safe? I don't know if that's safe, and it's just so paradoxical. Anyway.
It is. No, I mean, I was in Lithuania when that was happening. I remember seeing the images in newspapers and what was happening in the Ukraine. And it's so interesting that I felt invincible being in another country, being in another culture by myself. Yeah. I was going for the gospel. I felt this safety, or I'm not sure, but I was untouchable. And then now when I think about sending my children, of course, there's that fear. And I don't know what that's about, but there's a complexity there. It's about the work of letting go, probably, and trusting God.
That.
Yeah.
And FYI, it doesn't change when they get to be adults.
Oh, don't tell me that. I can't.
So in your book, Theology of the Womb, you talk about all stages of pregnancy, including postpartum, and you've written a couple of articles recently that I'm aware of now, and one which just appeared online in Red Tent Living, which, by the way, for everyone is redtentliving.com, and one that's going to appear shortly, having to do with kind of taking a postpartum view of 2021. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that term?
Yes. Originally, when I was working with my clients through 2020 and through grief and through loss and loneliness, there was so much fear that was growing. Fear was growing. Anxiety was growing. Even as the election came around, societally, the climate, everyone was trying to digest, if you will, all of these feelings. And it was just growing inside. And I think something of 2021, someone said to me, well, I just can't wait till 2021. New Year's, we're going to, be okay. And I thought, that's interesting, because psychologically, it isn't the actual holidays that we fear people harming themselves, right? It's actually right after. It's right after the celebration. It's right after the release. It's in the dark of the winter when spring is about to come. At least in the Seattle area, that's with seasonal affect disorder. That's whenever we fear most suicidality is happening right at that edge. It's when hope is about to come. And so I think it's interesting, as I was thinking about this, what is our PTSD? What's our post-traumatic stress going to be from 2020? And then I was sitting there one night and I thought, okay, well, when we birth 2020, postpartum's going to hit. And it was just this epiphany for me of like, postpartum is not, you're not done. Yes, you have this baby. Yes, you have this child, but your body is still actually trying to figure out what to do with what it's let go of. And I think that's what maybe our bodies will all be doing, is trying to figure out what we just lived through and survived. And what will we do as we tether hope? I mean, even with a vaccination, we might not even get there until summertime, right? There's something of these next months that are a bit jarring, and it's a lot to hold hope. And it's a lot more stress when our bodies expected relief on New Year's Day. And I think I want us to remember it's not kind for us to ask our bodies to respond so quickly. Oh, it's going to be okay. And we're such in a society where everything is immediate. Everything happens so immediate, and we don't have an understanding of the patience that we need to have the resilience to make it to springtime, to make it to the hope. So that was the feeling of the idea of postpartum as it translates to this post-traumatic stress. And I think, what's hard for me is, particularly in my story, my first child was stillborn. And I almost wonder if 2020 was a year of stillbirth and of birthing a stillborn. And so now we're in postpartum and our bodies are kind of responding to birthing death in a sense.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
So since you brought it up,
Yeah.
You use a term in, I guess it's Theology of the Womb, talking about the postpartum being filled with, quote, annihilating PTSD. And you just mentioned PTSD. What would those symptoms, do you think, look like in 2021? What does PTSD look like in this coming year?
Right. I think it's when we engage normal activities that were normal and are no longer normal. Easy activities. So the first time you go and see your family that you didn't see in 2020, or the first time you do something normal, like sit in a restaurant and you don't wear a mask, the first time you hug someone, the PTSD is your body saying, like, this is what I've known and what was taken from me. And so the coming back into normalcy, I think we're going to see a lot of it. I think our bodies are going to feel it, and we're not going to have terminology for it. So we're going to go to hug someone, and we will either be grateful like we've never been before. We'll be really sad, and we won't understand why. We'll be overjoyed, and we won't understand why. I think the gamut, just like in postpartum, I think there's a lot of ways we could respond, but I think they're going to be in the simple moments that we have been asked to not do. My kids wear a mask when they go outside, like what's going to happen, when I'm not at the playground anymore saying, oh, keep your distance. Don't play with that child. Just play from afar. So what happens in those moments in my kids' brains when I say, oh, you're fine, you're free to go?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a cognitive shock. And they will feel feelings that they don't have words for. And I think the same for our entire society.
Cool. Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
And the other thing is too, if this would just end, and we could be done with it, and then we could move on, but it doesn't seem to want to end.
Right.
That's the other thing.
Right. And the threat of it being something else. If this did just end somehow, if it was eradicated in some miraculous way, what is the threat now in our minds of something else happening, of a different kind of trauma? And that's where you see PTSD. What if it happens again? What if something else happens? But you're right. There's something of the lingering of, will this end? And even if it does end, what else? Because I didn't expect this. So what else is possible? Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everyone thought, just speaking from a university perspective, everyone thought, oh, spring will be so much better than fall. We put off all of the sports from the fall. We didn't have any sports. So all the sports will be in the spring. That's not looking super great right now, but we'll see how things work out. Well, could you talk specifically about what you call trauma bonds as the concept relates to 2020? What are these things, and what should we be aware of?
Sure. There's like a goodness, in some ways, a masked goodness of trauma bonds, because you feel close to people. You survived the pandemic, me too. There's something of that. There's a bond there, but also a trauma bond is a limited bond, meaning whatever my individual experience was and whatever your individual experience was, I don't know the details of yours, but I assume it based on the trauma bond. I assume we experienced the same thing. And I think that cuts out actually the individuality. And so we might expect the same things from everyone. This country went through the pandemic. The whole world went through the pandemic. And so there's a bit of a bond in that process. And there can be goodness. We can play on the goodness of it if we are aware of it. And then we also need to be mindful of how it holds us back from certain things, the unexpected. We don't know what to expect. That's where I was going back to. You may feel something differently when you see a family member you weren't allowed to see, or when you weren't allowed to go to a funeral of someone you loved, a grandparent or something, or weren't with someone when they were dying and you wanted to be with them. There are these griefs that are very different. Some people don't know anyone who died of COVID. Mm-hmm. And some people very intimately know the grief of being separated in death. These kind of things we get trauma bonded on. And we aren't bonded by, maybe we could push to be bonded on our resilience, but we're bonded on a really hard, terrible year.
Yeah.
A traumatic.
Well, I know that people talk, in more like church circles and stuff like that, of like soul ties, exactly. And that there can be these obviously very positive soul ties like marriage, but then there can be these abusive soul ties, and people never quite, climb out of it, and it is always affecting other relationships, that they have.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A soul tie. I mean, what do you vow? What did you vow in 2020 silently that you would never do again? Because of the cost of a pandemic, because of the cost of a protest. Like there's some places where we get stuck because we decide, no, I don't want to participate in something this difficult. And we make I don't know if I want to go as far as saying we're bonding with evil, but in a sense, a soul tie is that. And a vow, though, I would say psychologically, there were some vows that everyone made. The same way we made New Year's resolutions, we made vows when there was difficulty of, I won't wear a mask. I won't get a vaccine. Who knows what your vow was? Or I won't go outside until I get a vaccine. We all probably made some vow with the lack of control that we had because we don't want to feel out of control.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious, along with those lines, I don't know if this is a term or a posture, but I've noticed it in some of our Christian circles, almost an exhaustion of caring. It's almost like there's so much, of course, a banner year with protests, election, global pandemic. It was like the nightmare of all nightmares. Yes. But it's almost like there's a limited bandwidth for compassion and the capacity to carry the grief of others. And I feel like in Christian circles, we're expected to bear the burdens of one another. But in a social media age where we have so many one another's and are so deeply connected to people
right
from such a broad area, has that become even more pronounced now? And what would be your counsel to those who have read so many Facebook posts that friends have shared from other friends who they're not connected to, and they're praying for this person who they don't know and this other person, and they got their own grief that they're carrying? What would be your counsel to someone in that position?
Yeah, the work of the church, every church staff, my heart has gone out to. I mean, even counseling a lot of, pastors or people on church staff and churches that are not making the money they need to stay open. Churches that don't, what we thrive on is being together. Even house church, that's how it happened in the days of old, was the togetherness. We broke bread together. That's the people group we are. That's where we get so many things from. And so there's a kindness to maybe some of these big mega churches that my kids watch online on Sundays. And then yet there's, a handful of churches, especially just recently, who, because of a Christmas Eve service or because of, these special services that they did not want to give up, are now quarantined or are now in COVID, and they're tired too. And so there's something that the pandemic is, one, bringing a virus that makes us tired. And there's another thing of an entire year of being told we cannot be together, which is our complete calling. Is we know the love of Christ because we love each other and we give ourselves to each other. And so I think that exhaustion, that's the farce of media. Sadly, social media tells us we're connecting, but really it's hard to connect with grief over online. We comment on something, but what is it for me to bring a meal to someone's house, or to let them weep in my arms, or to bring meals after a funeral? We've been cut off from those processes. And so we don't get the dopamine hit, the reward of being together. And I think, I think that is so hard. How many churches, friends and clients and pastors who, we have some churches making broth and dropping it off on porches with communion. And then we have some churches meeting outside together. We're trying, I see the church trying to be so creative, but the church is weary and the resources are low, and it's been a long time. And it's very hard to navigate what to do when media is telling you one thing, government's telling you something else, when you don't even know what is the best leadership. And so I think there's just so many levels of complexity to the exhaustion that we have to be kind. We have to, especially as caregivers in the church, be kind to ourselves, be kind to our staff, be kind to our community. This is where we push into our resilience of what can I take? What still can I give? Where do I need care? This is just the limited work. And I do think, churches that have kind of gone back to house church and pods and only, quarantining with smaller groups have been able to hold stamina longer. But especially the masses of churches, it's exhausting. And so I think kindness is probably the only thing I could offer, is kindness to your exhaustion and to your weariness, because we have not been allowed to we don't know what's right anymore. We don't know how to go to a hospital room and give a last prayer or a last song, singing a song over someone who is, entering into death and into heaven. We've been stripped of those kindnesses and those gifts that that's what pastoring is, shepherding. And our brains have been trying to figure out, is that good or bad? Am I putting someone in danger, or am I caring for someone? That's exhausting because we've never shepherded and cared through pandemics.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.